Welcome, my little YouTubers. We're talking about classical China today, and wanted to go over quickly the dynasties that were in power during classical Chinese civilization. And you will remember from class that the first one, the ancient one in antiquity, was the Shang dynasty. And in our classical period in China, we have the Zhou dynasty, which was the longest lasting one during this period, but probably the weakest, the Qin dynasty, which was the shortest lasting one, but probably one of the most significant, and then the Han dynasty, which we should remember as kind of the most kind of the epitome of classical China was during the Han dynasty, where it all came together. So briefly, the Zhou dynasty was one of the longest ones from before 1000 BCE, lasting up until the 300s or so BCE. However, this was not a very strong dynasty. The emperors during this dynasty were fairly weak. They relied on a decentralized form of government. And if you remember, decentralized means they relied on loyalty of the powerful people around China. And while the empire did grow, and it was a pretty expansive empire at this time, uh, the power of the emperor was relatively weak because the warlords and nobles from around China could kind of do as they pleased, and the emperor couldn't really check them. So in a way, this is kind of like feudalism, relying on loyalty from your vassals or people who are below you, and it didn't really work out very well for the Zhou emperors. However, some important things happened during the Zhou dynasty. First of all, China was expanded, and they did have control over much of what is now China. Not quite what is as expansive as China now, but a large part of it. Secondly, a couple of big philosophies came out of this time period that started to gain some notoriety. Uh, Taoism and Confucianism both came out of this time period, although Taoism more of a religious philosophy and didn't have a huge impact on government because really kind of rejected the idea of government. And then Confucianism, which didn't have a huge impact early on, but would later during the Han Dynasty. So this was the two kind of important philosophical things that came out of the Zhou Dynasty. And it ended with kind of this chaotic, non-controlled period where the Zhou emperors really had no power in China. So directly following this came the Qin dynasty, and led by one man, Qin Shi Huangdi, who is known as the first emperor of China because of his kind of brutal tactics and his way of unifying the entire country and kind of setting the precedent for what an emperor should do. So Qin Shi Huangdi consolidated power. He took control from the warlords and other nobles who were around China by basically taking power from them and naming his own bureaucrats, people who would be in charge in the area, so that their loyalty would be to him and only him, and they wouldn't attempt kind of to have their own armies or their own control. And he was very brutal. He would kill any opponents, did not like to be opposed even in thought, and so ordered people to death, ordered books to be burnt that went against his idea, and very much adopted this policy of legalism, the idea that strict laws needed to be in place in order for society to um, run smoothly. And indeed, that's what happened. And really, any kind of absolute ruler or dictator would still adopt these policies, and indeed, it creates an effective means to which control people through fear. However, the people didn't enjoy this so much, and so even though he had consolidated power and become this big force in China, he was eventually very much hated, and despite his achievements, his building of the Great Wall and his centralization of power, and even kind of starting to use this bureaucratic system, which was effective and smooth running in China, he became pretty unpopular because you don't like to be afraid all the time. He also instituted a census and standardized kind of weights and measures and written language throughout China, so that China was uniform and kind of set that precedent. Upon his death, the people of China needed something different and not so brutal, And so in comes the Wu Ti and the Han dynasty. So the Han dynasty is kind of this balance between the Zhou and the Qin. They kept centralization of power, but they lost some of the very brutal and repressive tactics. And in fact, they brought back Confucius, and Confucius even became almost like a god during this time because of how much his philosophies were embraced by the Han emperors. And so again, Confucius was all about respect and relationships among people in order for society to run smoothly. And so the leaders kind of had the idea that they needed to please the people by being just and fair rulers, but they expected the people to obey them as well. So the bureaucracy was expanded. The civil service examinations were put into place. It became very important for the bureaucrats to be well educated so that the country could be run by the educated elite. And things ran smoothly. They expanded the country. It became a 400-year dynasty, roughly, that held power, and it was so strong that even after the dynasty ended with the invasion of the Huns, who finally kind of put an end to Han power, 300 years later, when China got kind of back on its feet again, the same policies that were put in place by the Han were put back into place by the new leaders in the next time period that we're going to study. So these are the major dynasties during the classical period. I hope this helps to kind of clarify some things. And don't forget to be awesome. Have a good night.